Green light on, yay. How many engineers did it take to turn on a microphone? Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Doolittle Institute. My name is Carolyn Fries, and I'm the director here. We are a partnership intermediary for the Air Force Research Labs Munitions Directorate here at Eglin Air Force Base. And we are very proud this morning to have on hand to talk about Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, the Space Shuttle Challenger Disaster, Dr. James Hansen. Before we introduce him and bring him on up, I want to tell you a little bit about what we do for the Air Force Research Labs. As a partnership intermediary, we act as kind of the go-between between the folks at the lab and the folks out in the community. So universities that may want to do research projects with the Air Force Research Labs, small businesses or startups that may want to license technologies that have been developed at the labs. Students and teachers that are interested in new STEM programs for the Northwest Florida region. We are involved in all of those things, trying to find new collaborators, helping to build a future workforce for the Air Force Research Labs, and also increase and improve our local economy through commercialization of government-sponsored or government-funded technologies. So we're very proud of our activities here, and every now and then we also have the pleasure of doing a public event like this to help educate folks on science and technology. And for those of you that were around when the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster happened, I'm sure, like the assassination of Kennedy, you probably remember where you were at that moment when you found out or when you saw it happen. If you happen to be watching the TV, or down here in Florida, you might have actually been watching it in person. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. James Hansen to tell us the story of Truth, Lies, and O-Rings.
Oh, switch?
Yep, we're not hearing you, sorry. Oh, I got it. Here, there we go.
We good now? Yeah, I knew it wasn't resonating very well. Anyway, I've been very busy with trying to keep Hollywood from going too crazy with making stuff up. You know, I tried so hard to get the story straight, and it was exciting being part of the movie, but it was also pretty stressful because, you know, again, there were times when I thought they were going a little bit too far, had it kind of wrong, and I had to try to, you know, work things out. So anyway, but I'm here today to talk about Challenger. And as a teacher, I always did some math before I started teaching my freshman classes. The math was, well, what year did these students get born? You know, what are they going to remember and what are they going to not know anything about? And doing the math for Challenger, you know, this was 1986 when it occurred. You know, that's 32 years ago now, right? Is my math okay? Can anybody confirm my math? You know, and so if you're not 32 years old, you know, you weren't here, and, you know, you probably had to be at least 6, 7, 8, 9 years old before it even registered, you know, what was happening. So this is one of those events, but for quite a while in my life and in the life of some of the folks that are in the audience, this was very, very, I mean, Challenger was something that was in the forefront of your recollections. But for a lot of you, this is just history. I mean, it might as well be the Middle Ages or something. You know, it was that long ago. So I'm going to try to tell the story of Challenger for you in particular who don't know it, and for those of you that lived through it, maybe I'll have some things for you that will be new. Okay. maybe I have to turn this on too. Here we go. Yeah. There's a famous line from U.S. space history that says, failure is not an option. You've all heard that, right? Failure is not an option. You know where it comes from? Yeah, it comes from the movie Apollo 13. How many of you have seen that movie? How many of you have seen it more than once? Yeah, you've seen it. It's a great movie. From the late 80s, I think it is. So if you've never seen it, you should see it. The line, failure is not an option, is uttered, when we go back, uttered by an actor who you see here, Ed Harris, who in the movie is playing a man named Gene Kranz, one of the legendary flight directors at Mission Control in Houston. In the movie, you hear Kranz in Mission Control. Mission Control is trying to figure out a way to get the crippled Apollo 13 spacecraft back home safely. And you hear Ed Harris say, "We've never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option." Later, failure is not an option became the title of an autobiographical book written by the same Gene Kranz. And it grew, that phrase grew into a very popular and much repeated phrase representing the attitude that no matter how bad the situation, how bad things may get, stay calm, don't panic, never give up on finding a solution, simply refuse to give in to failure. And there's a lot of good things to say about the concept of failure as not an option. But in truth, I'm not one of the biggest fans of the quote. For one thing, and this may be a little petty, Gene Kranz actually did not express those words himself. The movie makers invented the phrase. The scriptwriter gave it to the Kranz character, and the rest is history. It's Kranz, even though in truth he never said it. It was first said in a movie. But that's kind of petty. My bigger problem with the concept is as nicely positive as it is to assert that failure is not an option. The truth is, in the real world of engineering and human endeavor, failure abounds. Failure happens all the time, in virtually every field. You may not want failure to be an option, and you may and should do your damnedest to avoid it, but sorry, failure is ubiquitous. Failure is, in fact, an elemental part of our entire human experience. Now here you see one of my all-time favorite books. To Engineer is Human, The Role of Failure in Successful Design, written by Henry Petrosky, who at the time he wrote it was chairman of the Civil Engineering Department at Duke University. The title of the book sort of says it all, but I have a few quotes from the book that elaborate on the basic idea. And you probably all can read it, but maybe in the back if the print's too small. Failure is central to engineering. Every single calculation that an engineer makes is a failure calculation. Engineering is achieving function while avoiding failure. Then the last part of this one, successful engineering is all about understanding how things break or fail. And then finally, the concept of failure is central to understanding engineering. For engineering design has as its first and foremost objective the obviation of failure. No body of ideas influenced me more as a young historian of technology, a few decades back now, than the work of Henry Petrosky. Especially this idea that the first and foremost objective of engineering was the obviation of failure. There's a new word for maybe some of you, if you don't. To obviate is to anticipate, prevent, or eliminate difficulties or disadvantages by effective measures. So for those of you that are engineering students or engineers or aspiring engineers, if you go home to Thanksgiving and somebody asks you, well, what does an engineer do? And you can just puff up your chest and proudly say, I obviate failure. That'll get them, that'll shut them up. But that's obviation of failure is really, in a nutshell, that's the best definition of engineering that I could provide. Now, I applied this insight from reading Petrosky into all my books, and I applied it in the classroom. At Auburn, I built a 300, now a 3,000 level course called Case Studies of Technological Failure, in which my students would begin by reading Petrosky, and then we would read 3 or 4 books dealing with specific technological failures. And then, as a semester-long project, each student would research and write a term paper on some other specific technological failure that had occurred somewhere in the world in the past 100 years, followed by an oral presentation on their research. And there was no shortage of topics, because failures and accidents were all over the place. Building failures, bridge failures, nuclear power plant accidents, catastrophic failures of all sorts, minor and major. And my own specialization within the history of technology was in the history of flight. And indeed, accidents, failures, catastrophes checkered the history of flight, has checkered the history of flight, whether one is looking at the history of aviation or the history of spaceflight. Now, one failure that my students was always very interested in studying was the disaster involving the Space Shuttle Challenger, which occurred on January 28, 1986. This was just a few months before I began teaching at Auburn. When it happened, and remember some of you, and maybe know this for the first time for the younger folks here today, Challenger was the first time that the United States ever lost astronauts during an actual flight. We had a tragic accident that had occurred in 1967 in January, another late January accident when the Apollo fire took place. It was during a routine test. We lost 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White. So that terrible thing had happened, but we had never lost anyone in flight. When Challenger occurred, I was working as a NASA historian. I was working on a book at NASA Langley Research Center in Virginia. And I was, ironically, at work, in fact, on a chapter dealing with the early history of a rocket, maybe even the old-timers here may not remember it, a rocket known as Scout. Scout was a relatively small 4-stage solid fuel rocket that was conceived in the late 1950s as a simple but effective way of boosting light payloads into orbit from the NASA facility at Wallops Island on the eastern shore of Virginia. And the problem was, as Scout entered development in the early 1960s, it kept having one failure after another. I mean, this is right along the Atlantic Ocean, so there's so many failures that the people at Wallops Island started referring to Scout as 3, 2, 1, splash. 3, 2, 1, splash. It just encountered failure after failure. And only failures come in batches, but they're never quite the same failure. For 4 years, just about every time Scout launched, something bad happened. And eventually, after failures, more than NASA could care to count, the engineers finally got Scout to work, and it worked very well. And it made a total of 113 successful flights and turned into one of the finest pieces of technology in the history of space exploration, but not until it had failed over and over again, and NASA had figured out why. So just here I am working on Scout, writing about all these failures. I'm at NASA Langley, and it's sometime after 11:39 in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, Tuesday, January 28, 1986, and a friend of mine comes running into my office to tell me that the space shuttle had just blown up. It's not really quite true. I'll talk about that in a second. It certainly, to call it a blowing up, an explosion, is not quite correct in the common sense usage of that word, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. It was incredible. It was stunning. Nothing had hit the country this hard since the assassination of President Kennedy, as was said earlier. And as I said, this was the first time ever that we lost any of our astronauts during an actual space mission. The Russians had lost some, but we hadn't. And it happened right before our eyes, on our television sets. We saw the whole awful thing. And not only were there 7 astronauts on board, but one of them was payload specialist Krista McAuliffe from New Hampshire, who would have been the first teacher in space. And all around the country, classrooms were watching the launch because this teacher was going up. There's actually famous footage, I don't recommend seeing it, it's heartbreaking, but of Krista's own class in New Hampshire watching it and seeing what happens. And the cameras see the faces of the children not understanding, but finally understanding. The media coverage of the accident was nonstop and sensational. One study later reported that 90% of Americans had heard the news of Challenger within an hour of the accident. And over the next several days, we would see Challenger, this was STS-51L, we would see it explode into pieces multiple times as TV kept repeating the launch to explosion footage over and over again. Of course, as a NASA historian, I followed this very, very closely, especially after President Reagan established a special presidential commission to investigate the disaster. And this was interesting at the time. When the Apollo fire occurred 20 years earlier, roughly, NASA did its own internal investigation. It was all kept inside NASA. But President Reagan felt like this needed to be more transparent. NASA didn't need to be investigating itself. And so he created this special presidential commission of independent, very noteworthy individuals. I'll mention a few of them. So that was a difference. It was a public investigation, not a private NASA investigation. So I followed all of this closely. The commission was made of 14 members, led by a former Secretary of State, William Rogers. And the hearings for this commission were covered live on radio and television almost in their entirety. There were some closed sessions that you didn't get that. But for the next several weeks, and this all kept happening until the panel released its findings in June of 1986, so it took them a few months. The books on Challenger soon got published, and I think really too soon. And here you see the covers of the first 2 books on Challenger, A Major Malfunction by a young journalist, Malcolm McConnell, came out in the spring of '87. So, there were authors that went right to work on Challenger, and they got these out as quickly as they could. And then another book, Prologue for Disaster, by another journalist, Joseph J. Trento, about the same time. And so they were competing publications. And if you read the bibliographical essay that I wrote for the end of Truth Lies in O-Rings, you can see what I thought about these two books. Essentially, they were journalistic exposés that were pretty deficient in lasting value because they lacked the dispassion and the informed technical and programmatic analysis that were really needed to understand what had happened with Challenger. I'll talk about one other book and then move on to my book with Alan McDonald. Next book that's worth talking about, I think, came out in 1996, and it was more substantial, entitled The Challenger Launch Decision, Risky Technology, Culture, and Deviance at NASA. Its author, Dr. Diane Vaughan, was a professor of sociology at Boston College, and what her book argued in a nutshell was that the roots of the Challenger disaster were to be found in the very nature of modern institutional life. Vaughan built a case around her notion that all organizations develop cultural beliefs that shape their actions and outcomes, not all of them for the good. And in Vaughan's view, NASA during the 70s and 80s, the post-Apollo period when the shuttle program was defined, turned into an organization whose dominant underlying psychology was that it was in a very rough place institutionally because it was competing for such scarce government resources, budget. And this special sense of budgetary challenge fostered an organizational structure and a culture in NASA that accepted taking big risks and cutting corners as norms, as something that was normal. And her conclusion was, therefore, it was not political pressure or conspiracy or any kind of incompetence that led to the Challenger accident. And that was what McConnell and Trento books had essentially put forward. Rather, according to Vaughan, it was a long series of small and seemingly harmless modifications to technical and procedural standards that infected NASA over the course of several years. And she wrote that no specific rules had been broken in the Challenger decision or at NASA or by any of its contractors, but instead the fault lay in the cumulative weight of mundane organizational norms and groupthink dynamics that ultimately made NASA and its chief shuttle contractors vulnerable to making some very bad decisions, like launching Challenger that particular morning. Well, a lot of people found Vaughan's analysis compelling. The whole idea of some level of deviant behavior becoming normalized under pressure inside of an organization. And for many people, her book became almost the Bible of what caused the Challenger accident, and even something NASA came to accept as the party line. Because what Vaughan's analysis suggested was that no one in particular, certainly no specific individuals, were personally responsible for the accident. What was at fault was that something had gone wrong inside the organizational culture as a whole. So impressed were a lot of people with Vaughan's analysis that after the Columbia shuttle accident in 2003, they put Diane Vaughan on the commission to investigate the reasons for the accident. Well, there are other Challenger books I could talk about, but I need to move on to the one that I helped Alan McDonald write, Truth, Lies, and O-Rings, which was published in 2009. Who was Alan McDonald? Well, first thing I'll say, in relation to the book, he's the first one that had anything to do with the decision to launch Challenger that wrote a book about it. So these others weren't involved. Al was deeply involved, as you'll see. So who was this guy? Al was born in Cody, Wyoming in 1937, the youngest of 4 children. His family eventually moved to Bozeman, Montana, where he spent most of his childhood, as you might imagine a boy in Montana doing. That was kind of his growing up. Attending Montana State University, he received an associate degree in engineering in 1957, critical year because that's the same year that the Soviet Union launches Sputnik and the space age begins. And then he went on to earn a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering in 1959. Out of school, he got a job. Excuse me, I've had some allergies and hopefully I can keep this cough under control. Al got a job with a Utah company called Morton Thiokol, where he worked on the first stage of the Minuteman ballistic missile. When the Space Shuttle program started in the 1970s, Alan McDonald was still at Morton Thiokol, and he got assigned to be one of Thiokol's chief engineers for the design of the solid rocket booster for the shuttle, to launch the shuttle. And at the time of the Challenger accident, Al's formal title was Director of the Space Shuttle Solid Rocket Motor Project. Well, on that day that STS-51L lifted off, Al was at work in the launch control room at Kennedy Space Center here in Florida. He was there as the Thiokol representative. The night before, he had received a telephone call from a fellow who worked for him reporting that a weather forecaster in Orlando was forecasting a cold front coming into the Cape that could drop temperatures to as low as 18 degrees Fahrenheit by the next morning. That was not good news. As Thiokol's director of solid rocket motors and the company's primary representative at the Cape, Al was responsible for everything about the operation of those solid rocket boosters that were snapped to the side of the shuttle. And Al knew, based on NASA and Morton Thiokol data, that the rubber O-ring seals that sealed the field joints mating the various segments of the solid rocket boosters would not operate properly at such low temperatures. They had that from, they saw results from previous flights. They knew what the condition of the seals were. They knew it from their own tests. They knew that those rubber O-rings at low temperatures would get hard, they would grow rigid, and they would not make a proper seal. So Al got on the phone and he made 3 phone calls. The first he made to meteorologists at the Cape to learn what weather they were projecting hour by hour all through the night. The second call he made to his engineers in Utah, asking them to calculate, I should say, what the actual temperatures would be on the various parts of the solid rocket boosters at the time the launch window opened for Challenger the next morning. More than that, he told his engineers in Utah to make an assessment of their concerns of the cold temperatures on the sealing of those O-rings. And he wanted them to make a recommendation as soon as possible on the lowest temperature. What would the lowest temperature be that those SRBs could tolerate at the time of launch and still do their job safely? Al told the guys in Utah, and this is a quote from the book, "I want that recommendation and decision made by the Vice President of Engineering, not by program management." So he wanted the Director of Engineering to make sure he made the call. He wanted that because he felt the O-ring performance issue, how those O-rings performed in cold weather, what the test data was about that was a pretty thorny technical issue, and it should be decided on its technical merits only, not by corporate management. His third call was to his company's representative at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. And in that call, Al asked for a teleconference to take place that same evening. A 3-way conversation between the Thiokol engineers in Utah, the NASA guys in charge of the shuttle at Huntsville, and the Thiokol reps at the Kennedy Space Center, basically him. This 3-way teleconference quickly got arranged. And in that teleconference, Thiokol's Vice President of Engineering, a man by the name of Bob Lund, recommended to NASA that the shuttle not be launched below 53 degrees Fahrenheit, because data from testing and from analysis of the condition of the O-rings on the recovered boosters from previous shuttle launch, because these SRBs were picked up out of the ocean and refabbed and reassembled and used again. So they had data on how those O-rings looked after each launch. Based on that, Lund said that it showed pretty clearly that the O-rings were not going to perform as well as they needed to in lower temperatures. And here is actually a copy of the Lund recommendation, the original Lund recommendation from Thiokol, saying the O-ring temperature must be equal to or greater than 53 degrees at launch. Well, the NASA guys in Huntsville, on that teleconference, did not like that conclusion very much. They didn't believe that the data about the O-rings was all that conclusive. And they wanted Thiokol to show them something more definitive before they would accept that launch commitment criteria be changed to a lower temperature. The top shuttle guy at Marshall, a guy named Larry Malloy, in fact, has expressed his frustration at one point in the teleconference, shouting over the phone, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch? Next April? The eve of a launch is a hell of a time to be generating new launch commit criteria." At that point, a man named Joe Kilminster, who was vice president of the Space Booster Program at Thiokol in Utah, came on the telecom and asked for a 5-minute offline caucus. In other words, we need to talk by ourselves, So he told NASA, Kilminster told NASA he wanted to make sure Thiokol was presenting everything that it had available to them and see if they could better analyze and determine whether there was a lower temperature that would be safe. That caucus was supposed to last 5 minutes. It lasted 30. And we wish we still knew even more. I mean, some of the guys that were there have since been pretty outspoken about what happened. And that's going to be a crucial part of our conversation by the time we're done with this. It would have been, as a historian, I'd love to be a fly on the wall to what really happened in those 30 minutes. Of course, Alan McDonald in Florida, since they went offline, he did not hear what went on in Utah inside his company during that half hour. But he was surprised as heck when the teleconference resumed after 30 minutes, and on came Joe Kilminster telling NASA that the Thiokol engineers had taken another hard look at all their data and concluded that it was okay, after all, to proceed with the launch as planned. No restrictions at all, no temperature requirement whatsoever. Well, NASA's reaction in Huntsville was, well, that's good. The Huntsville guys accepted that abrupt change of mind without questioning. Apparently, they got the answer they wanted. But they wanted more. Malloy told Joe Kilminster that NASA needed that recommendation put in writing and signed by a responsible Thiokol official. Well, back in Florida, with his mouth open, Al McDonald knew who that responsible Thiokol official was going to be. Him. That's why he was there at the Cape. And Al made, at that moment, what he came to feel was the smartest decision he ever made in his life. He refused to sign it. For McDonald, and again, he doesn't know for sure what's happened in this 30 minutes offline conversation with his engineers and management back in Utah. But he is really suspicious that some major ethical violation is happening. It wasn't that he thought it was unethical that NASA people were questioning how Thiokol arrived at their original no launch decision. I mean, that's kind of in the nature, of engineer speak. But what was unethical, he thought, was that the NASA officials knew that the job, the obligation of Thiokol, its contractor on the SRB, its obligation, Thiokol's, was to prove that it was safe to launch the shuttle. And here was NASA putting Thiokol and its engineers in the position where they had to prove it would fail. That's a totally different question. You're never supposed to do that. In fact, the final decision inside Thiokol, which McDonald didn't know at the time, he only found out later because he wasn't in the loop, was that Joe Kilminster's own boss, a man named Cal Wiggins, who was vice president and general manager of the company, had taken over in Utah, the meeting in Utah, during this offline caucus, and had decided not to go with the technical judgment of his engineers, but instead recommend going ahead with the morning launch. And as Al wrote in Truth Lies in O-Rings, it was a classic case where good technical judgment and common sense seemed to have yielded to the philosophy, the customer is always right. The customer here, of course, being NASA. As I said, Al McDonald was so disturbed by his company's change to a launch recommendation that he refused to sign that recommendation. He didn't understand it, he didn't feel good about it, so he forced his boss in Utah, Joe Kilminster, to sign it and to fax it to Kennedy Space Center. Well, while he waited for the fax to arrive, Al turned to some of the key NASA people at the Cape with whom he worked, and also talked to some of the Boeing people who were there. Their responsibility was the orbiter. And Al said to them, you know, I don't really feel comfortable with this decision. I don't agree with it. But more importantly, you, talking to the NASA guys, you yourselves cannot even accept that recommendation in my view. What do you mean, Al? They asked. Well, you cannot accept it because you know, and I know, that you are asking us to fly those boosters outside a temperature it's been qualified to fly in. And you can't do that. You can't fly any of the shuttle hardware outside of its qualification limits. That's against protocol. So you can't accept it. I'm against launching not based on what I know, but because of what I do not know. And you're in exactly the same position. It's just not worth taking the risk with all these unknowns. But Al, these shouldn't be your concerns, they told him. You shouldn't really concern yourself with them, but we'll pass them on in an advisory capacity. And here's the Kilminster fax that eventually arrived. Al had to go down to the fax machine at the end of the hallway and grab it and take it back and give it to the NASA guys. But you can see down here at the bottom the key element of it, where it says MTI, which basically is Thornton Thiokol Company, recommends STS-51L launch proceed on 28 January 1986. And it's basically saying we think it's going to be okay. Well, the story now moves on to the morning of the launch. Waking up early, McDonald remembers hearing on the radio that the temperature was 22 degrees. Arriving at the Launch Control Center and sitting down at the console where he monitored all of the data on the solid rocket boosters, he could see on a large TV screen that there was quite a bit of ice hanging on the shuttle, sitting on the launch pad. And he quickly concluded for himself, well, there's no way they're going to launch this thing today. Look at all that ice. A few minutes later, he saw an ICE team, a NASA ICE team, dispatched to the launch platform to knock down as much of the ice as possible, not just on Challenger itself, but on the launch platform. And less than an hour later, of course, the launch countdown had to stop each time they went out, but a second time the ICE team went out and did the same thing. And when it got back after taking off more ice, the ICE team reported that it was okay to proceed with the launch. A conclusion that Al did not agree with. In truth, what Al expected in terms of the catastrophe that could come was that if the O-rings failed because of cold temperature, they would fail right at the instant of ignition, right as the solid rocket boosters lit. But as we know, the catastrophe did not happen then. It only manifested 73 seconds later. And to be precise, the breakup of the vehicle began at t plus 73.162 seconds at an altitude of 48,000 feet. In the launch control room, Al could hear some people sobbing in the background. They all knew what just happened was not survivable. What they didn't know at the time, and would only find out really months later, is that the crew did not die instantly. The crew was still all alive when the orbiter hit the ocean, number of seconds later. But it's still probably right to say it was not survivable. The day after Challenger, Al flew to Huntsville to be part of the failure analysis team. And neither he nor anyone else at that point knew that the failure of an O-ring was the cause of the tragedy. In fact, he was just about convinced that the accident was caused, well, he thought, and made a lot of sense, caused by a cracked turbine blade in the Space Shuttle main engines. That had always been the biggest fear about the shuttle system. The turbopumps in the three main liquid fuel engines churning away at 35,000 RPM, their thin-walled combustion chambers burning vast quantities of high-energy hydrogen at 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hydrogen that seconds before had been stored as a liquid at minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what everybody thought, where the failure would come if one came. And that's what Alan McDonald and many others thought at first. It had to be a cracked rotor blade, turbine blade, that was the source of the failure. If one of those blades became cracked, came loose, went flying into the external tank, that could cause what they saw, what happened. But one of my favorite phrases, and this sort of applies to engineering and history, facts murder theory. And a few days after Al arrived in Huntsville, his worst fear for Thiokol came home to roost when word arrived from NASA guys down at the Cape who were looking at the films of the launch that the movies showed some fire coming out of the aft side of the right solid rocket booster just before the explosion. When Al heard that, and soon saw it for himself in the films that came up, that meant the accident probably did happen exactly for the reason that he and Thiokol engineers were concerned the night before the launch. The O-rings were too cold to perform their function. It wasn't until President Reagan decided to form a presidential commission that the real answer came out, and the real answer didn't come out initially or very willingly from NASA. Over the weeks, it became frustratingly clear to McDonald that NASA officials really didn't want to hear about cold O-rings or anything about how Thiokol had at the last minute changed its recommendation from red to green. But things soon got hairy when the Presidential Commission started investigating. A story got into the New York Times that a government budget analyst, a man by the name of Richard Cook, had sent headquarters a memo several months back expressing concern about all the problems the space shuttle was having with O-rings and field joints and how much money the problem might take to fix. Well, this news story sparked a lot of concern in the Presidential Commission because NASA officials so far had not breathed a word about the O-rings or any other specific thing that could have caused the accident. The commissioners knew nothing at all about any of this, even though almost a week earlier, Al McDonald had briefed NASA at headquarters on exactly what had caused the accident, the O-rings. Well, concerned that it was possibly hearing more about the cause of the accident from the New York Times than it was from NASA, the Rogers Commission scheduled a closed hearing in which NASA was to make a comprehensive briefing. And the person chose to give the briefing was none other than Larry Malloy, the Huntsville shuttle official who had complained to Thiokol in that ill-fated teleconference that it wanted him to wait until next April to launch, which, of course, they never said that. Ironically, virtually all of the charts that Malloy showed in this briefing came from Al McDonald, who in the past couple weeks had given long reports to NASA about the O-rings as the clearest cause of the accident. So Malloy is using Al's view graphs to make this presentation to the Presidential Commission. Al attended the meeting. It was a closed meeting held in the old executive office building next to the White House. Al sat in the very back of the room because Malloy and the other NASA officials, oh geez, that's never supposed to happen, is it? You're supposed to tell people not to do that. I thought for sure my phone was off. Apologize. Failure. Failure. There's failures that happen every ways. Yeah. Almost like I couldn't have planned it any better, right? He sat in the back of the room. Good gosh. It must have been something in the phone. It's not mine. Okay. Al sat in the back of the room because Malloy and the other NASA officials on the agenda, there were others who couldn't be part of the briefing later in the day, had made it very clear to McDonald and to Thiokol that they, the NASA folks, were going to give the entire briefing. No one else needed to make any comments unless they were specifically requested to do so. The entire morning was taken up by Malloy's presentation using Al's charts. He briefed for nearly 2 hours until the commission broke for lunch. Returning from the lunch break, one of the commissioners, Dr. Sally Ride, first American woman in space, sat down and started thumbing through a bunch of pink slips containing telephone messages that she had apparently gotten that morning. And as the session was about to resume, Dr. Ride spoke up and said to Larry Malloy, "Well, before we get back to our briefing, I'd like to ask you a few questions, Mr. Malloy. During the break, I returned a few of my phone calls, and one of them was from a reporter here in Washington who told me he had heard a rumor that one of the shuttle contractors may have been concerned before the launch about the cold temperatures affecting the shuttle hardware and maybe even recommended not launching. Is that true, Mr. Malloy?" And Malloy paused, then answered, "Yes, we did have a teleconference with Morton Thiokol's concerns about the projected temperatures on the field joints and O-rings." No, that was honest. But then Malloy went on to say, "But after hearing all the discussion, we all concluded there was no problem with the predicted temperatures for the solid rocket motors, and I received a document from the solid rocket motor project management at Thiokol to that effect, that there was no adverse consequence expected due to the temperatures on the night of the 27th. Well, by this point, as you can imagine, Al McDonald is doing not a slow burn, but a pretty fast burn. He's sitting in the back of the room thinking to himself, well, I guess that's a true statement, but that is about as misleading as anything I have ever heard. And it is certainly not ethical. So what did Al McDonald do? What would you do? He started walking from the back of the room down the stairs toward the conference table where the Presidential Commission was sitting. And what did Larry Malloy do when he saw Al McDonald coming down the steps? Well, he was in a pretty tight spot. He sees Al come forward, and perhaps optimistically, Mr. Malloy surmises that Al is coming down to give him a hand, to help him explain the view graphs. And what in fact Malloy said to the commission was, "Mr. Chairman, Alan McDonald from Morton Thiokol wants to make a point." You bet your sweet behind he did. In a nutshell, what Al said was, "I think this commission should know that Morton Thiokol was so concerned about the projected cold temperatures on our field joints and O-rings that our original recommendation based on our data was not to launch below 53 degrees Fahrenheit." It was like a bomb had gone off in the room. "Who the hell are you?" Chairman Rogers said. I'm the director of the solid rocket motor project at Morton Thiokol. To which Rogers said, would you please come down here and repeat what you've just said? Because if I just heard what I think I heard, then this may be in litigation for years to come. At that moment, Alan McDonald's life changed forever, because he knew who was going to be in the middle of all of that litigation for years to come, him. And from that day on, Al decided he better write down everything he knew, in as much detail as he could remember, everything he heard, everything that was published in the press. And he did that for the next 3 years. In June 1986, as I said earlier, some 17 weeks after the commission issued its report, after the tragedy, the commission issued its report to President Reagan. And what it reported was that the Challenger accident was caused by a failure in the O-ring sealing in the aft field on the right solid rocket booster, causing pressurized hot gases to flame and eventually blow by the O-ring, and from there contact the adjacent external tank, causing major structural failure. The failure of O-rings was attributed to a design flaw, as their performance could be too easily compromised by factors including low temperature on the day of the launch. It was a conclusion that Al McDonald agreed with pretty much completely. But Al's story was far from over. After his first full testimony to the commission, he was called in by Thiokol management. Do you think they were going to give him a raise? And what they said to him was, he was no longer going to be the head of the solid rocket program. He was going to be head of scheduling. Scheduling. Scheduling, he asked. What in the hell are we going to schedule? We're not going to have anything, we're not going to build anything for a while. What we build is certainly not going to be what we have been building. Well, Thiokol, basically, they took all of his engineers away from him. They gave him this non-job, as he considered it. And furthermore, Thiokol management told him, oh, you're also off the failure team. You can't have any interactions with NASA, none. You can't do any of the failure analysis. In other words, he can't be an engineer. Well, Al was put into purgatory because he had had the courage and the ethical backbone to tell the truth. Purgatory didn't last all that long, as it turned out. One of the members of the Presidential Commission, Air Force General Don Kutina, saw Al at a meeting of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, one of the sponsors of my talk today. Kutina saw Al at a meeting in Washington, D.C., and General Kutina came up to Al and said, what the hell are you doing here? You need to spend all your time figuring out why the shuttle failed the way that it did. To which Al said, I'm not doing that anymore. I haven't been doing that for some time. What do you mean you aren't doing that anymore? Well, I was on the failure team, but I got removed from that. Well, when did you get removed from that? Right after I testified to you guys? Well, that's bullshit. You know how generals talk. Yes. Kutina said, we'll soon fix that problem. Well, Al later learned that General Kutina called the chairman at Morton Thiokol and told the chairman to bring in all of his top corporate buddies to listen to what the general had to say. And the good general read them the riot act. And the next thing Al heard from his bosses was he was going to be head of the whole redesign team for fixing the problem on the shuttle. So Al took charge of the redesign team that was to fix the SRBs, a very high priority task force that involved Thiokol and NASA engineers and managers. A task that was very high priority because it was critically important to the country's space programs, civilian and military, to get the shuttle back flying safely as soon as possible, which it did. Task force did a superb job, did so under great scrutiny, including serious scrutiny by the National Research Council and from the National Academy of Engineering. And by the time the task force finished its work, the SRBs were, in the opinion of most folks closely associated with the shuttle, the safest piece of equipment on the shuttle. And from the time shuttle flights resumed with the launch of Discovery in September 1988 to the very last shuttle flight by Atlantis in July 2011, all of the flown SRBs came back pristine, involving some 110 launches. Of course, there would be one more catastrophic failure with the demise of the shuttle Columbia on February 1st, 2003. After all the lessons learned from Challenger, one might have thought that something like that couldn't happen again. Even 17 years later, I can talk about Columbia a little bit if you want me to in Q&A. But let's wrap some things up with some final thoughts on Challenger, on engineering ethics, and on technological failure. The biggest breach of ethics in Challenger, in my view, and my view has been strongly influenced by Alan McDonald's view, was that both Thiokol and NASA attempted to cover up what really happened that night before the launch. There was definite obfuscation by NASA on what really caused the accident until it was not possible to obfuscate any longer. It's one thing to make a mistake in deciding to launch Challenger while ostensibly pressuring the maker of the SRB to change its launch recommendation, but it's another, perhaps a more terrible breach, when people in high places with time to think about it continued to deceive and cover up. Looking back on all the decisions and things that happened, I would suggest that there are 4 levels of ethical breaches to discuss with Challenger. And these 4 don't really correspond to the pyramid very well, but they do it in some ways, and so it's not an exact match, but it's a graphic there that you can look at as I go through this. So I think there's 4 levels of ethics violations. There's a level 1 ethics violation associated with having to make difficult decisions with tough pressure time constraints in a very stressful environment, and then making a bad decision or making a decision for a bad reason, a poor reason. I mean, you might even debate whether that is really an ethical violation if you're just making a bad decision under pressure. Is that an ethics issue, or is it something else? Level 2 involves individuals who know that the dangers exist, yet don't say anything. And this is a serious breach of professional ethics, this silence, which sometimes turns into the biggest obstacle to overcome in any decision-making that involves risk. Still worse, a more severe breach of ethics occurs at level 3 when those who believe that an accident may be more likely than what has been discussed, or that their organization is willing to admit, nonetheless support the decision to proceed because they recognize that is what their bosses want them to do, and they can benefit some way by supporting their boss. And finally, the worst breach of ethics, level 4, occurs with those who participate in a cover-up, blaming others or intentionally distorting the facts to avoid blame. And this could be argued is far worse because if the cover-up is successful, it could lead to another accident in the future for the very same technical reason or unethical decision-making process that should have been corrected. Finally, I want to say that there absolutely can be accidents, and are accidents, that are totally independent of ethical violations at any level. There are many, many instances where technological failures or accidents result from the purest definition of an accident, not expected, not foreseen, not intended. Indeed, accidents and failures appear to be inevitable in the wake of prolonged success, which encourages lower margins of safety and overconfidence. And it's at this point where you've had prolonged success and you become kind of overconfident and cocky about it, it's at this point when many failures occur, which in turn leads to a breaking of confidence, to a new rigor to scrutinize, to greater safety margins, and hence to new periods of success. So it almost seems like it's a cyclical kind of thing. Ladies and gentlemen, there will always be failures and disasters as engineers and designers push the boundaries by building taller buildings, longer bridges, or by reaching farther into space. Each time there is a failure or a disaster, changes are made and regulations introduced only to be outstripped by further developments. Even if you're not directly involved as an engineer or manager, you as a member of society are certain to be affected by technological disasters and catastrophic failures over the course of your lifetime. Understanding why they happen, how ethical breaches might be involved, and how they can perhaps be better handled by society when they do occur is of vital importance to the health and vitality of our modern world. So I close with a final statement from Petrosky. It is not that success stories cannot serve as models of good design or as exemplars of creative engineering. They can do that, but they cannot teach us how close to failure they are. Thank you. So, how do you want me to handle the Q&A? Do we have a microphone out in the audience?
Check, check. There we go. So I think if you have any questions, we'll raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic, and that way we can all hear the question. So, and if you don't mind, maybe I'll just pick who it is that way. And maybe just introduce yourself so everyone kind of knows who we are. And
my name's David Hogg. You were looking at your ethical pyramid. There was a line in there that I've always remembered that I think is correct, but I was curious if you could enlighten me as to who said it. There was a point in, I believe, the meeting you were discussing with Thiokol where someone said to the nature, as reported to have said, you need to take off your engineering hat and put on your managerial hat.
Yeah.
And I think it really entails to your ethical pyramid, because that's where you get someone who is basically saying, we don't care if engineering-wise you're right, you're messing up with our program stuff.
Yeah.
And you're going to hurt our image. Is that a true story? I
That's
honestly don't know.
an accurate quote as related by some of the people, some of the engineers that were at the meeting at Thiokol. And it obviously was something that someone from management said. You know, it wasn't an engineer saying, let's take off our engineers' hats and put on management hats. That isn't what the engineers are going to say. It was someone from management, it could have been Kilminster, it could have been Cal Wiggins, who said, you know, look at it from our point of view. Take off your engineer's cap for a second, put on a management hat, and see what decision you'd make then. So it is a very critical point. And why I would love to have been a fly on the wall, that 30-minute conversation in Thiokol was, we know, quite heated. And there were engineers that were not happy, that did not like instantly give in to this. They fought it, but they knew they were fighting a losing battle. And in the end, you know, their voice, they weren't on the phone to tell NASA the change in the recommendation. There was a man, there's other, I mean, our book's a big book, and I tried to, you know, shorten it and focus on Al. But there are other characters in this story that are really worth studying. There was a O-ring expert within Thiokol named Roger Beaujolais, and Roger becomes one of the main witnesses at the commission. And he was aware of the O-ring data better than anybody, better than McDonald. And Beaujolais was in that meeting. And Beaujolais had a hard time. He died a few years ago of cancer. He had a very hard time emotionally, fought depression, and just because he felt tremendous guilt that he did not do more, that he should have been able to do something. He could have left that meeting. I mean, this is something he said in an oral history. He could have left that meeting and called the White House himself directly and told them what had happened and why the shuttle should not launch the next morning. He didn't do that and regretted it to the end of his life that he didn't do more. He had fought the battle inside of his own organization, but when it's clear that his own management wasn't going to support the engineering conclusion, you know, at some point you just had to let him do it. Now, the question I will ask you, I'd be interested in what you think. Why do you think the management in Thiokol changed the view, changed the recommendation, and overruled their own engineers. Well, how would you explain that? I mean, they're management, they're not engineers. They want to satisfy NASA, okay. Is there anything else to it that you would want to suggest is going on? Yeah, go, yes.
They've enjoyed success up to that point. They simply didn't believe they were going to have an issue.
When you say they, you mean? Thiokol, the management. So they were questioning, they thought their engineers were being too conservative, perhaps. Correct. Okay. Yeah.
I think also it was the sign of the times. You know, there was a lot of innovation and things that were going on at that time, and I think the general attitude, not only of industry but also of the economy and everything else, was sort of push forward, continued success. Mm-hmm. So I think that certainly led to possibly some inflated attitudes that precipitated. Or that could have precipitated it.
Any other thoughts? Those are both very good.
Sorry, yeah. I would say it's the contract that the company had with the government, with NASA, because more than likely it had something in there about who had to pay for the redesign, and yeah.
Okay. So are you suggesting that money was somehow an issue?
Oh, definitely.
Does money come into play in the real world in terms of, okay? Let me ask you this. I'll ask you a leading question. Who knows what a sole source contract is? Yes, sir.
Sole source contract is kind of a sweetheart deal between the government and the contractor, that you go to them either because they're the only producer of the item. That's theoretically the only reason you're supposed to. Unfortunately, the reality is it's usually the guys you like.
Okay. Did Thiokol have a sole source contract with the government to provide solid rocket boosters? Yes, it did. What if, I'll start this as a hypothetical, what if in the months previous to January of 1986, from several months in advance of that, Thiokol had been hearing rumors and getting some fairly direct suggestions that NASA really thought it would be a good idea to have a second contractor also building SRBs. In other words, Thiokol, how do you think Thiokol management would react to the whole possibility that somebody else is going to be tapping into the market for the boosters besides them? The one thing that I always, I mean, maybe it's just my own analysis, but, you know, and it's in our book, but I've heard Alan McDonald give lots and lots of presentations on Challenger, and he does a much better job than me. But one thing he never really focuses on that I think is really maybe the central issue is, I mean, do we call it corporate greed? Profit, it's profit motive for sure. I mean, if you have a company that's making money, a lot of money, being the only company that's manufacturing solid rocket boosters for the shuttle. Remember, shuttle at that point in time was the whole kit and caboodle. It was supposed, you know, it was launching everything. You know, a lot of rocket programs have been shut down because shuttle was going to do it all. Well, we learned once we had Challenger that maybe wasn't such a great idea. But they're making lots and lots and planning to make lots more SRBs. And all of a sudden they get wind of this, well, NASA is interested in having a second source for the SRBs. Would those Thiokol managers be in a position more than ever that they want to keep NASA happy? I mean, I think you can have all these fancy sociological analyses of culture and groupthink and all this kind of stuff, and they're all worth talking about. But if you don't talk about corporate greed and profit motive and money as a major factor in why, I mean, and I just ask you this, if there had been no fear of losing the sole source contract, if there had been absolutely no fear, if that had never come up, do you think Thiokol management might have supported their engineers that night? They would have been, it seems to me, more likely to have done it. Maybe they still wouldn't have done it, but they would have been more likely to do it because they're on more solid ground. Because NASA had nobody else to turn to but them. And so if they say, we're not going to launch, you better listen to them. They're the only people building these for us. I don't know. I mean, I just think it's worth us thinking about this. Yes, sir, in the back.
So, had there been rumors of a second source, or had
Absolutely, there had been. Absolutely, there had been. Thiokol was well aware of it. And again, it's funny, this didn't really even come up in the Rogers Commission investigation. And if you read the report, there's really almost no discussion of that issue. And to me, again, I'm not sure, you know, it's one of those big what-if questions. What if? You can't say for sure what would have happened. But it seems to me it could have been something significant. Yeah?
A separate question. Is there a reason they couldn't just put a sticker on it that said, do not launch below 53 and keep the program going? They stopped the shuttle program for 2.5 years.
So who would have put the sticker on saying that? Yeah. Well, the engineers would have been fine with that.
Now you're getting into the politics of don't launch 2.5 to 3 years. How do I?
Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind about this is that, you know, there had been a number of delays in the shuttle schedule. I mean, when shuttle was sold and planned as our major space program in the 70s and 80s, the suggestion was that shuttle was going to be like a truck. I mean, it was going to be an operational vehicle. It wasn't just going to be experimental. It was going to be flying. I don't know what the most optimistic is. Anybody remember? But I think the suggestion was it could maybe go up once a week.
It was like one shot every 2 weeks was the most optimistic.
Yeah. They just thought it was going to be, you know, it was going to be reusable, and they'd just have an assembly line. They'd be, you know, shoot them, SRBs get picked up, you bring them back in, you refab them, external tank, you know, orbiters, you got several orbiters. You know, the idea was that this was going to happen, and it didn't happen that much, did it? Because it was a little more difficult to get something flying into space safely than maybe NASA thought. You know. Yeah, yeah. It had. I mean, there had been delays in the launch. And so when Malloy says to Thiokol, when do you want us to wait? And, you know, you going to have us wait till next April? I mean, that clearly was in relation to the temperature issue, but NASA had faced a lot of delays. And a lot of the times it's because of the contractors. I mean, Boeing, the orbiter contractor, had to give its permission or its recommendation for launch also. And so sometimes it was the contractor who did say, no, we're not ready. Sometimes it was the satellite or the payload in the orbiter that somehow was messing up and wasn't quite ready to go. And so it was sometimes the payload. I mean, I went to a couple of shuttle launches that were delayed because of payload issues. It wasn't anything wrong with the system necessarily. It was the payload that was a problem. Yes?
Should I say my name? Yeah, sure. I am Milo Raz, and I remember, but correct me if I'm wrong, I remember you saying that the Challenger didn't necessarily explode in a way.
Yeah.
So I would like you to elaborate on what actually happened to the shuttle.
Yeah. There were some fuel, some propellant tanks that did, in fact, explode. But what bothers me and some other people about calling it an explosion is it sort of makes it sound like everything just explodes. But if you look at the pictures, this doesn't show it quite as well, but the two solid rocket boosters, they keep flying. I mean, they're not like flying like you want them to fly, because they're supposed to still, you know, they're supposed to come off at some point. But the SRBs are still flying, and the orbiter, you know, where the crew members are, you know, there are good pictures you can find on the internet that shows you and has like a diagram or they mark where the orbiter was. But the orbiter was essentially intact until it hit the ocean. So my concern with the explosion notion It's really more that, that it disintegrated. Big parts of it came off. And not that there wasn't some explosions that took place, but to think of it as just one big explosion that occurred that immediately killed the astronauts, blew up everything all at once, that didn't happen. So that's what I would say. Yeah, question in the back?
When we did the forensics on the film, we finally found a 70-millimeter analysis that rejected NASA experiments in. We're using sub 70 millimeter anymore. The front end of the orbiter was pretty much intact until impact.
Right.
And they had breach, lost pressure, which is why on the return to flight, they had crew and pressure systems. Whereas up to that point, they just continued on. But there were life science chemistry and they were act on a number of crew members.
Sir, would you please introduce yourself and tell us what you did in the shuttle program?
I'm Donald Snyder. I'm out at AFRL, and I was one of the national image interpreters that was called in at the end of after the incident to bring the technology together to try to forensically examine all the documentary film and thing that were taken to try to understand what had happened. And probably mostly was a structural damage caused a void in the pressure vessel due to the main tank explosion.
Right.
It wasn't the SRB. It was
Right.
there was some break loose of the main tank supports and R25s, R27s, the maneuvering engines, hydrazine explosion, and so there was a lot of structural. So there's no way they could have flown it, you know.
Right.
So it was ballistic from that point on, but for 14, 18 seconds, there was still significant life sign telemetry until impact.
Well, thank you for that. You know, it's been 32 years, but you know, I'm on a number of email lists, and some of especially these are mostly guys now retired, but there's still a lot of conversation, discussion, speculation. There are some people, some engineers who don't believe that the Presidential Commission's report was accurate, that it wasn't really the O-rings that were the problem. I'm on the side, I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I can't, you know, my opinion isn't I've read a lot of engineering documents, but I'm not a trained engineer. I mean, my belief in the Presidential Commission comes for 2 or 3 reasons. One, the commission was really a group of very distinguished people. I've had long discussions with General Kutina, who I admire a lot, and I know what he has had to say. I wrote Neil Armstrong's biography. Neil was vice chairman of the investigation. He was kind of Mr. Inside, and William Rogers was Mr. Outside. Neil was a very, very good engineer, Purdue engineer graduate. And Neil, I had long, long talks with Neil, both for my biography and for this book, about Challenger. And then there's Alan McDonald, who I've spent lots and lots and lots of time with. And when I have, you know, Kutina, and I have Armstrong, and I have McDonald, and the Presidential Commission, all on the side of this conclusion, you know, I don't have the credentials to question that, but I do have reasons that I think these guys are pretty solid, and you know. But there are there are people that say that they think it wasn't the O-rings because the secondary. See, there was a primary O-ring, a secondary O-ring, and the secondary O-ring, the seating, it's working properly. That has been called into question. You know, how well it might have worked or did not work. But there are some who say that it was a structural failure with the external tank that really was the cause. And then there are others who say, you know, when the SRBs are recovered from the ocean, you got to take them and refab them, right? You got to get them ready. And the SRB comes in, you know, the outside of it comes in segments. And so these segments have to be they're reconnected. And the segment where, for the aft side of the solid rocket booster, right side solid rocket booster, there's evidence afterwards that those segments were out of round. And that maybe the way, not that some procedure was done wrong, but nonetheless, that there's some out of round that maybe was the primary factor. So I just bring these up not to say, just that it's fascinating, you know, from an engineering analysis, you know, when you've got people 30 years after the fact that are still debating what really was the reason. And I think the truth of the matter is, with a lot of accidents and failures, you know, you might not have the right answer. You might not. You know, and maybe it's worth looking at. This is why I thought my course on technological failure was so important for students to take. You know, that they could take one failure and they could really deal with its history, look at the technical documents. And I really wanted engineering students to be taking the class, and I always get some, but how many of you are engineering students or a product of an engineering program? Most of you, right? How much flexibility was there in your curriculum? Did you have a lot of elective hours to take? No, it's kind of laid out. And now what? It takes 5 years, really, basically, to finish an engineering program, right? I mean, there's no extra time. And the only time I could teach students anything about the history of technology was when they were freshmen. Well, how many engineering courses are you taking as freshmen? None. I mean, you're taking your history, and you're taking your English, and you're taking, or, you know, I don't know what else you're taking, math, you know. So I'm talking to, quote, engineering students. I mean, they declare themselves as engineering students, but I'm talking to them before they've taken a single engineering class. And what I needed to do was have them come in when they were seniors, or juniors at least, when they've actually taken some engineering, and they know something about failure analysis methods, and then they could take a look at a case study of a failure and actually do something significant with it. Well, I did my best with what I had. Yes, ma'am.
So rolling back the time clock to 1986, I think we had pagers, right? I mean, the internet wasn't out there yet. If you
No
had a
email.
cell phone, it was, you know, the size of a large backpack, maybe. You know, no internet, no cell phones, no social media, you know, no pocket cameras to take. So if you were to take those technologies and put them back into 1986, do you think it would have a different impact? Would things have come out differently?
Very good question. I could turn around and ask you if you're thinking of anything in particular. I guess the one thing that first comes to my mind is how different would that teleconference be, right? Because there would be big screens where you'd see everybody, right? You'd see everybody. And, you know, when Kilminster's changing the launch recommendation to green, you know, I'd like to see, I mean, if those engineers could be, maybe they'd make sure, okay, get out of the picture. You're not going to, you know, make sure the camera doesn't show Roger Beaujolais, you know, because he's over there fuming, you know, he's throwing stuff against the wall. You know, it's possible that with the new, just the communications technology being different, that the visual aspects would be there as well as, you know, the audio. So that alone could have been a big difference. You wouldn't be waiting on faxes, probably. I mean, maybe you would still need to have a fax come from Utah to Florida that has the launch recommendation. Were you thinking of some other? I'd be interested.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
You know, today it seems like something happens and bam, millions of people know about it
Yeah.
in seconds sometimes.
Yeah, if I had been Al McDonald, and I'm in Florida, and they call that caucus, okay, where's my cell phone at? Al McDonald's got his cell phone, and all of a sudden the teleconference is turned off. I'm going to get on my phone and see what Beaujolais has to say. So I'm going to call and say, Roger, what's going on? Or text. The SOBs are going to make us wear management hats. You know, could that change it? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if that would change anything. It would be a different scene, a different scenario for sure. It was, yes.
Hi, I work for NASA on the shuttle program. I was wondering if you were planning on writing anything on Columbia and whether you thought, as a historian, anything had really changed at NASA after those disasters, if they actually...
Not enough, I guess, is my answer. I haven't studied Columbia as well as I have Challenger. The thing that bothers me about Columbia, and this is probably going to oversimplify this. But with Columbia, the problem was, for those young people that don't know, this was in February 1st, 2003. It's funny that late January, early February in NASA history, I mean, geez, you got, Apollo fire happens in late January, the Challenger happens in late January, the Columbia happens in 1st of February. It's like, that's something weird going on there, just coincidence. But a fairly large piece of foam insulation on the external tank comes off at launch and hits the leading edge of the orbiter. And it damages the leading edge. So Columbia gets up into orbit, does its thing. NASA knows there's been, and I'll let you correct me and add to this in a second. NASA knows there's been some damage, but they don't know how much damage, okay? There's some guys at NASA Langley, some engineers at NASA Langley, the place where I first worked. I told you about working on the Scout history, and I wrote 2 books on the history of NASA Langley. There were guys at NASA Langley in 2003 who said, and they recommended to NASA, they put in a formal request, let's get the Department of Defense to get one of its military satellites, one of its spy satellites, turn it around, and put a camera on the damage on that wing, that leading edge on the orbiter, so we can see how bad it is. So these guys think it makes sense. Because, and here's where I'm not sure what would have happened. Let's say they would have done that. They didn't do that because, well, here's what happened. They sent the request in to NASA, and it was denied on the basis that Boeing had done a very extensive study using a super-duper Cray computer and had done analysis of damage like this, simulated, and had concluded from this analysis, this computer analysis, that the damage could not be so bad from a piece of ramp foam, could not be so bad that the shuttle would have any problems, any danger flying back down through the atmosphere to a landing. So the Langley request to have the DoD spy satellite take pictures was denied. Now, I guess here's what's somewhat speculative, and I've never been sure of the answer. If they had seen how much damage there was, and if they had taken pictures and that showed, this is not good, could they have done an EVA to do anything to repair that damage? Would they at least wanted to have given it a try? Would you want to give those astronauts a shot at fixing damage that the spy camera is showing? This is really significant, So because what happened is as it comes down through the reentry, that structure starts to break up and disintegrate, and that causes the loss of the vehicle and the crew. So, the guys at Langley obviously thought it was going to be serious, or could very well be serious. We need to know what the damage really is, and then let's make an assessment. I mean, failure is not an option, right? I mean, that's sort of inbuilt into the NASA mentality by then, right? Failure is not an option. Well, if it's not an option, then we should at least give the astronauts a chance to do something to fix the structure. But again, it was denied. And I know Al, when he talks about Columbia, he thinks it's terrible that NASA made a terrible, terrible mistake not to approve that Langley request to get that camera looking at that damage to see. He thinks that's a major, major problem. Because he says it shows a change in culture. This gets to your question. It changes change in culture from can-do attitude to can't do. And he sees that as a major change in the organizational culture, the technical culture of NASA.
NASA did know in '92. I worked an orbital debris program with NASA.
You want to speak up a little bit?
Oh, in '92 I worked an orbital debris program with NASA.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the tests we did involved a sphere that was about 5 centimeters. And involved aluminum sphere. It was actually a little over 4 centimeters.
See what debris could do to the
And the
orbiter.
reason we picked that particular size in conjunction with NASA is at the time, it couldn't be seen by radar. But if that sphere hit the shuttle anywhere on its body, the shuttle could not re-enter safely. They knew that back in '92.
Yeah.
Just want to make one comment about NASA culture. The woman that made that decision to not let the DoD look at the shuttle.
It was a woman that made the decision?
Yeah, she eventually.
I don't know who it was. Yeah.
She eventually was promoted to pretty high position at NASA. They put her away for a while until things died down, and then she.
I'll have
did
to look
pretty
into
well.
that. I don't
Yeah.
know the specifics of that, but
Yeah.
so it was this would have been at headquarters level, not necessarily the administrator, but an associate administrator, or.
No, it was at Houston.
Oh, this was at Houston. Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm not an engineer. You know, I've lived with engineers and written about engineers and done oral history with engineers for 40-some years now. So I guess I have a little bit of an understanding. But I guess not being an engineer, I would still say, if I was one of those astronauts in Columbia and NASA came up and said, look, we've seen the damage to your orbiter. It's significant, and we really are worried about it. You know, I would have been on the side of knowing that rather than not knowing that. If nothing else, just to be honest with the astronauts and then try to work out something. I mean, I think about Apollo 13. Go watch that movie. How ground control had to come up with a lot of fixes. And it happened between conversations between guys at Mission Control and guys, you know, in the Apollo spacecraft. And they came up with fixes. Could they have fixed that wing structure?
A rescue mission.
That's another option. Yeah, I didn't even think. You could have sent another orbiter up there to try to get them all out. So.
Sir.
Right here. Yeah.
All right, Zach Ezel. During the Challenger investigation process, was there any time that they did any testing to try to reproduce the O-ring failure?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of additional testing done, and that data was shared with the commission as it was produced. So, yeah, McDonald and Beaujolais and lots of other people, you know, continued to, you know, educate the commissioners on the situation. There was another fellow that's certainly worth mentioning. He usually gets mentioned like he was the savior of the commission. There was a physicist named Dr. Richard Feynman. Really interesting man. He has written some great books about engineering. He actually worked on the Manhattan Project that built the first atomic bomb in the United States. And he was on the commission, and he did a famous, in front of the TV cameras, did a famous little demonstration where he took some of the material from the rubber O-rings and he dunked it in ice water and held it there for a while to prove the point about how cold temperatures affected the O-ring, you know, the elasticity of the O-ring. And so a lot of people give Feynman credit like somehow he figured it all out, you know. Yeah, that's going a little bit too far. He deserves a lot of credit, very interesting man, but not quite as important to it as I think as sometimes it's been projected. I will tell you that, you know, sometimes people ask me, well, what temperatures did Challenger launch at? It launched at 36 degrees ambient temperature. The temperature at the joint where the leak occurred with the O-ring was 30 degrees. The lowest temperature that it had been launched at, you know, before was the 53 degrees, an earlier flight. So it was significantly colder. What's interesting, it's all local. I mean, the temperatures were locally different on the orbiter and on the system, because the solid rocket booster, like I said, where the problem occurs, the temperature is 30 degrees. If you go to the opposite side of the SRB, it's facing the sun, it was 50. So it varied, you know. But that wasn't, I mean, that was data that was known. That was data that was known or suspected, strongly suspected from, you know, they knew that kind of thing happened. Yes, right there in the red shirt. You want to wait for the microphone? It's fun to use a microphone.
I was wondering, why didn't the engineers consider putting the temperature in the O-ring in the first place?
Ah,
Why didn't they consider that?
good question. If you're using rubber, if you're using the O-ring, I guess the physics of it would be just such that, you know, rubber has a certain I mean, it's a matter of a certain kind, and you'd like to make it, excuse me? Material properties. Yeah, material properties. And so as long as you're using rubber in the O-ring to help seal, which is a very conventional, I mean, we have O-rings in all kinds of things. I mean, I can't think of one right now, but I mean, we use those sorts of seals a lot for different kinds of things. It's very standard kind of design. Yeah, yeah, lots of things. Yeah. So, I mean, you raise a very good question, because there are some people who argue, and I argue it a little bit differently from my understanding. The design of the O-ring, obviously, I had one slide where it showed how they redesigned it. They made it better. So one could say that the O-ring design, the joint seal design, was flawed from the start, okay? And clearly, it could be made better, and was. But I think what the Thiokol guys would say, and what Al would say if he were here answering your question, he would say, if the SRBs were operated in the environment they were qualified to operate in, with people realizing that the O-rings were going to lose their elasticity at a certain temperature, if they were just operated correctly, they wouldn't have been a problem. What was the problem with the design is when you started operating it outside of that environment. So clearly, once you have a problem with them, the smart thing was to make it so much better that you're not going to have a problem with it. There was one theory that I think has been blown out of the water, but there's a putty that is involved in this O-ring sealing thing. And there have been suggestions that that one element of this putty was there was a lot of asbestos in it. And asbestos is generally not a good thing. And there's a theory that you can find on the internet that says that there were federal regulations, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, was forcing NASA to change the putty that it was using because that putty had too much asbestos in it. And thus it was this federal regulation that really was, because there were indications that this putty had sort of bubbled up and didn't do as well as it should have done. But from my research into it, and I talked to several engineers about it, is they don't believe that was the case, that that's just people who want to take a shot at the EPA or federal regulations, that really it was that there were test procedures that changed that led to a change in the putty that NASA used. It wasn't, them being forced to change it because of the asbestos in this putty. So, I mean, one thing about, if you study the history of engineering, there's no way around studying the technical stuff. You've got to sort of stay up with that enough to kind of understand, because that's the world the engineers live in. I mean, that's been my career. I'm not an engineer, but if I'm really going to write about the world that the engineers live in, their organizations, their research laboratories, their companies, if you don't have a pretty good understanding of the technology, you're missing what they lived for, what they worked with. So, I had to understand. Yes, sir.
Back to the young lady's question about why didn't they have temperature sensors?
Yeah.
They actually had looked at PRTs, platinum resistor thermistors, to be embedded, because there's some commonality there in the evolution of the solid stacks for the shuttle and Peacekeeper. And they'd done that under some of the Peacekeeper. The problem is down at the Cape is they had several direct hits on and around during launches during the Apollo program, and early in the shuttle program they had tower strike on, I forget which launch. So
yeah.
Lightning, yeah. And so what you don't want is leads running out of that solid rocket booster stack as antennas, giving you a path to basically turn that platinum resistance thermometer into a fuse. and you get a burn going, which ignites the rocket fuel. So, you know, any sort of direct contact. We spent a lot of money working on a non-conductive fiber optic temperature sensor with geocenters out of Boston after that to see if we could in fact embed pressure and temperature sensors into the forecast on the solid stacks themselves, so we could actually measure propellant temperature and not just the external temperature at the stack. So anyway, but NASA's a whole different animal. You know, management is one thing. Engineers make us look like completely wild people because they take conservative to 5 decimal places.
Yeah. Well, I would say, you know, if Al were here, Al would want the young people in particular to think maybe about a couple things. One, you know, as great as those computers are that you work with, sometimes you can put too much belief in them. You need to believe, if you have done maybe some back of the envelope calculations, your own common sense, you know, your gut feeling about things, you know, maybe you shouldn't always trust those computer programs. You need to at least test them, check them really carefully against, and if they don't fit with what you're thinking and finding in other ways, and question them. I mean, clearly the Cray supercomputer, in the case of this analysis about the effects of, you know, some foam hitting the orbiter, was not right. And he'd also say this. He would say, have courage. You know, engineers work in organizations. They work in bureaucracies. They work in companies. Your company, if it's a company, it's going to be profit motivated. There may be times when you've got to stand up, you know, you've got to stand up on a position that your management's not going to like. Maybe you'd be concerned, well, if I oppose management on this, maybe I won't get that promotion. Maybe I won't get that new position, you know, and so I'm just going to go along. I'm not going to say anything. Let somebody else take care of it. Al would want you to think otherwise, would want you to be prepared, you know, because sometimes it's an individual position. Sometimes one guy and one guy alone has the right answer. Everybody else is wrong. That doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen. And you might in your career be in a position where you need to stick up for what you believe in and then let the chips fall. Otherwise, you might find yourself like Roger Beaujolais with his last 20 years of his life contemplating suicide and seriously, because he felt like when crunch time came in that teleconference, he let everybody down. He should have done more. So thank you very much. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. All right, everyone, we're going to take about a 15-minute break, and then right at 11, you'll have an opportunity to interact with Dr. Hansen a little bit more. We're going to do a little bit of a book signing, which will take place in our outside loop room, which is just across the way here. There are books out here for purchase for $25 cash or check if you need to pay by credit card. Bayou Books, just a few doors down to the right, is the one who is selling that. So you'll go ahead and go down there, purchase the book, and come right back here. So thank you very much. And let's give Dr. Hansen one more round of applause. Thank you.